The film opens with a compilation of videos of famous football legend, George Dreyer. He dominated the leagues with his terrific playmaker skills and striking capabilities. He has shown remarkable performance as a winger throughout his football career. His prime started in the early 90s and stretched till 2005. This was until he met an accident during one of his football games, which led to him retiring from professional football at 38. Many years later, George Dreyer, who once was one of the greatest football players, now seems to be recording football news for people. His phone rings and it is his credit card company trying to contact him since his rent is 120 days past due. He dresses up and goes out. As he is about to enter his car, his landlord confronts him about his security deposit being late for 2 weeks. George quickly gets in his car and tells his landlord that he is on his way to the bank right now. We get a clearer picture that George Dreyer, a retired football superstar, is in crippling debt. George enters a pawn shop and offers them all of his game-worn jerseys and boots that he wore in leagues such as the World Cup and Champions League. The owner of the pawn shop is surprised to see that George played against legends such as David Beckham. He asks George about why he is living in Georgia, but George quickly makes up a bunch of lies so he would not have to confront the shop owner. All of George's expectations go down the drain when the shop owner offers him just $300 for his jerseys and shoes. As he gets out of the shop, he quickly gets back into his car and rushes to Stacy's house. George has a son named Louis, but judging by George's financial situation, Stacy has custody. He quickly picks his son up as he is late for his football practice. On their way to the practice, his son gets upset since George has not been visiting him very often, so George promises him that he will visit him frequently now. After the football practice, George and his son go to a nearby diner to have lunch. After their lunch, George drops Louis back at Stacy's house and congratulates her at the diner. There, he learns from Louis that she is getting married to another guy named Matt. The next day, George goes to see his old friend who now seems to be working as a news anchor for sports news. George gives him the tape that he prepared, as he needs some sort of work to keep it up and running. George tells his friend about his financial situation and how none of the investments that he made paid off. Instead, they caused him a major loss. His friend promises him that he will look at his tape. The very next week, George takes Louis to football practice again. Only this time, he notices that Louis's football coach does nothing but stay on his phone the entire day and tells the kid to kick the ball with their feet. George has had enough. He gets up on the football field and starts to teach kids football. The kids respond to him instantly and learn how to shoot a ball. George also finds himself to be extremely cheerful when he is around kids. After the practice, he notices that while dropping Louis home, Louis is extremely pleased about what George did today. As George goes back to his home, Stacy calls him and gives him the news that his interaction with the kids today led to all the parents wanting him to be the new football coach. George declines at first, but then Stacy reminds him of how this would mean so much to Louis. George agrees to coach the football team. At practice, one of the kids' parents comes up to George to chat with him, and they all are extremely impressed about his past football achievements. He gives him an envelope full of money and tells George that his son, Hunter, would love to play as the goalkeeper, and that his daughter would be more than happy to sing the national anthem before matches. He gives him the money under the impression that he funds the football team every year. As George shines on the field, every parent's eyes look at his remarkable performance, and many of the parents are intrigued by him. This includes many of the mothers who see him as eye candy and a potential love interest. George heads back home and notices that he has 15 voicemails. He plays them all, and all of them are from the parents of the kids from the football team, who have inquiries about their kids and how they would like to see them play in their desired position. The very next week is match day. All the parents are in the audience, and after a fearsome pep talk, all the kids are in the spirit to win. Most of the single mothers there have their eyes fixed on George, as he seems to be pretty popular amongst women. The single mothers discuss how having George as a coach has made their kids' daily routine 100 times better, as now they have some sort of male authoritative figure in their lives. The team's name is Cyclones, and the Cyclones win the game with flying colors. Louis is going to spend the night with George. George shows Louis the bedroom that he prepared for Louis. The room has an old portrait of Louis, George, and Stacy. He tells Louis that this was when they were in Italy and when Louis was still a toddler. Afterward, George and Louis watch a movie and spend quality time together. After the film, George puts Louis to bed, but moments later Louis comes into George's room and tells him that he had a really bad dream. George, as a father, tries his best to comfort his son, but Louis is persistent on the fact that he wants to go back to his mother. George drops Louis back home and is disappointed in himself as he blames himself for Louis not trusting him enough. Stacy reassures him that Louis just needs some time and he will come around by himself. The next week, George comes to the practice again. Hunter's dad, Carl, stops him and greets him. Carl is very eager to be George's friend, and to show him a good gesture, he invites him to a party that he is about to throw at his house on Friday night. After his interaction with Carl, one more parent walks up to George named Barb. Barb is grateful to George for being a good coach and weirdly hugs him. As George initiates the practice of the football team, Catherine, Samantha's mom, tells George that they both have a mutual friend from the news channel, and she might give George's tape to his superiors. It hits George that this new job of his is paying off and is being very beneficial to him. He gets to spend more time with his son, and he does not even have to face more financial crises. Carl then forces George to show his talent on the pitch, and George does that. He shows everyone his accurate pinpoint shots and amazing dribbling techniques. It is Friday night, and George is having a great time with the guests at Carl's party. He steals the spotlight from everyone as he walks around the room telling everyone his stories from his football superstar days. He sits around with Carl for a bit, and Carl is now even more impressed with George after the party. Both of them walk out of the house together, and a car catches George's eye. It is a red convertible Ferrari. Carl tells George that he owns the Ferrari and that George should have it for a couple of days. George heads home in the Ferrari and sees that a certain guest is standing outside his house. It was Barb, who on inquiry reported that she was passing the neighborhood and thought that she should see George, as she is grateful for him listening to her rant. He invites her inside, and both of them have a drink together, and after talking for a while, both of them sleep together. George's landlord sees them from the window and is impressed by George's charisma around women. The next day, George wakes up by his phone. Carl calls him and asks him for a strange favor. He tells George that he got arrested last night and that he wants George to come and bail him. George explains to him that he has to take Louis to a football game today, but Carl convinces him to come. George picks up the bail money from Carl's house, goes straight to the jail, and bails Carl out. Carl admits that last night he had a few too many drinks and fought a man at the bar, which led to him being arrested. George drops Carl home, and then he calls Louis. He shares the news of the Ferrari he has with Louis because it is his dream car, which he used to call a rocket car. George picks his son up and he gets excited about the car. Since George had to break Carl out, he runs extremely late for the football match and then has to cancel that plan. Louis is upset about them missing the match, but remains excited about the car. George and Louis roam around the beautiful countryside of Virginia together in the red Ferrari. George notices that Louis is still a little upset about the football game, so he offers him to drive the Ferrari. Louis is extremely pleased and he starts to jump in excitement. Louis sits on George's lap and drives the car. He slowly accelerates the car and begins to get used to it. He accelerates around the straight path, but as soon as a bend comes, he loses control of the car. The car spins out, but, fortunately, nothing happens to the car, and both Louis and George are safe. George begs Louis not to tell his mother about the car spinning out, and Louis agrees. Both of them then get out of the car and walk down the road to a lake. As the two of them sit together, Louis asks his father about his opinion on his mother's second marriage. George does not lie to his son, and he tells him that he is sad about it, but Louis should not be, as his future stepfather is a good man, and that he should do whatever makes him happy. After sitting by the lake for an hour, George's phone rings. He picks it up and it's Denise. Denise was the same woman that George met earlier from football training, and she tells him that she loved the tape. She tells George that it still needs some work, and together both of them can make it better. She also tells George that some of her contacts at ESPN are looking for sportscasters, and if his tape is good enough, then they have a serious chance of him being employed at ESPN. She calls George over at her house, and without even thinking for a second, George starts his car and goes to her house with Louis. As soon as he reaches her house, Denise gives him a suit and tells him that they will be going to the studio. He leaves Louis at her house along with her daughter Samantha, and the two of them go to the studio together. At the studio, George initially gets very nervous about his audition, as there are a lot of cameras and lights pointing at him. But he slowly picks up his pace and gives a remarkable performance at the end, which impresses Denise. It is no surprise that George was popular amongst women, and Denise also makes her intentions very clear. She walks up to George and rants about her struggles of being a single mother, after which, she leans on George and kisses him. As soon as George leans on her, the lights go out. George rushes back to her house to pick Louis up, but he realizes that he is late because of his interaction with Denise. He drops Louis back home and goes back to his house. As he pulls up in his driveway, his landlord again confronts him about how he is driving a Ferrari while he still has not paid rent yet. Suddenly his phone rings again as Patty, Carl's wife, is calling. She confesses that she cannot control her feelings anymore and that she is now in his bed. George is surprised and asks her about how she entered his house since it was locked. George then realizes that Patty is not in his house but in his landlord's house. He instructs her to get out of there as soon as she can. Meanwhile, he stalls his landlord so he can buy enough time for Patty to come out. George takes out the big envelope that Carl gave him earlier and takes out $900 from it, which was his rent. He goes inside his house and sees Patty standing at his door. Both of them go inside and Patty grabs George and takes him to the bedroom. There she undresses, but George has no interest in doing anything intimate with her, because Carl is his friend and does him a ton of favors. Patty tries her best to seduce George, but he gets her out of the house. As soon as she is about to leave, George notices that his landlord is once again outside his door. George opens the door for him and his landlord reports that he gave him an extra $100 bill. As the two of them are talking, Patty walks out of the house overtly, which makes the landlord question George about his popularity amongst women. George believes that it has something to do with his Scottish accent. The next day, George goes to the practice and meets Denise. Denise informs him that her boss loved the tape and is now considering hiring him. George becomes very joyous after hearing that and spends some time with Denise. There, she tells him that she has been supporting him from the very beginning and she always had faith in him. She insinuates that if he sees her holding her right ear during the game, then it means that she is thinking about their time together at the studio. She pulls George closer and kisses him, but Louis catches them and gets upset. He had to wait at Denise's house for 6 hours yesterday, and now he has to watch her kiss his dad. Louis thinks to himself that his anger is justified, so he ignores both his parents and goes straight to the game. As the game starts, George gets a call from Barb, who is standing right behind him in the audience. George conveys that he is busy right now, but she says random stuff to him. As he looks back, he sees Denise grabbing her right ear and Barb waving at him. As he tries to handle the situation, he hears a celebration from the football field. He cuts her call and goes to the field only to find out that Louis has scored his first ever goal. He goes to Louis to congratulate him, but Louis pushes him away because his father wasn't even there to witness the goal. This is the first time that Louis has been rude to George, and it makes him very upset. He looks at Stacy in the audience, who is completely clueless about Louis. As the game resumes, George notices that Louis is very angry at the field. He deliberately fouls an opponent and earns himself a red card. As he walks out of the field, George stops him and asks him about his behavior. Louis again pushes George and declares that he hates both football and his dad. As Louis gets back home with his mother, he takes the house keys and goes in first. His mother is concerned about him as George calls her and asks about Louis's behavior. She comforts him and clarifies that Louis does not hate George. He just needs some space, but he is serious about leaving the football team. George requests Stacy to meet for lunch as he needs some parenting advice. They both get together for lunch and talk about their past. She advises George that the best way to handle this situation is to talk to Louis when his anger has cooled down. Both of them spend a great evening together afterward when they go to the bar. The very next day, George comes to Stacy's house to talk to Louis. He goes upstairs to his room and sees him playing video games. He mentions to Louis that whatever his decision is, he will support it, but quitting football is not the right way. He makes him realize that it is in Louis's blood to be good at football, and that he is missing out on the opportunity to be a professional football player like his dad if he quits now. He promises Louis that this time he is going to make things right. He is personally going to train Louis so that he can be an even better player than his dad. He takes Louis out in his car to the football field when it is raining cats and dogs. They are practicing when Louis' mother gets worried because of the weather and comes to the field to make sure that both of them are okay. She watches them play football and observes how happy they both are, which makes her tear up. As her tears of happiness flow down her face, she quietly goes back to her house. Louis then goes back to George's house, and this time, he sleeps together with George so that he would not have bad dreams. As he sleeps, George's phone rings and it is Denise. Denise incites George as she is right outside her house and claims that he should come out to have a chat with her. As George walks out of his house, he sees her standing beside her black convertible, excitedly waiting for him. She breaks the news to him that ESPN wants to meet him for an interview. George becomes very happy, and the next day he takes the first flight to another state to go to the main headquarters of ESPN. There, he starts his professional audition and reads from the script that he has been given. But since he is auditioning as a sports news anchor, he realizes that he can say a better script. So, he ignores the script and just goes with the flow. This leads to him giving a remarkable performance which impresses everyone at the studio. He is hired by the end of the day. A few days later, he walks Louis to Stacy's car after practice. Louis mentions that they are going to an arcade and extends the invitation to George. He doesn't want to impose on their fun, but Stacy also invites him. So, he tags along and they have a lot of fun playing air hockey and other games. He spends an entire day with them. This outing makes George realize that he actually still has feelings for her and is still very resistant to her getting married to another guy. He tries to talk her out of it as she is the only woman that he ever loved, but she tries to avoid the conversation. The next day, George goes to her house again to give her the news that he got the job. He drives his car into her driveway and goes inside her house. There, Matt informs him that Stacy is at a boutique right now, shopping for her wedding dress. Without wasting another moment, George drives to the boutique and goes into the dressing room. There, he sees Stacy in a white wedding dress. Stacy gets overwhelmed after seeing him and directs him to leave the boutique until he confesses his true feelings to her. He shows her the drawing that Louis made for them when they were living as a happy family. He confides in her about how he never moved on from her and how he does not want her to marry another guy. Stacy cries and begs George to not do this right now as her wedding is in a few hours and he is making her question every decision of her life. She runs out of the boutique and gets into her car where she has a major emotional breakdown. George catches up to her and tries to hug her, but she pushes him away and makes it known that she does not want to be touched right now. George's job requires him to move to another state for 2 years, and he still has no idea how he would give that news to Lewis, but eventually, he tells him. It is final game day and everyone is in their full spirit. As the game begins, Lewis scores the first goal. But right after that, the opposite team dominates the game by scoring another 2 goals. George orders Lewis and the whole team to focus and concentrate. He keeps all of them motivated throughout the entire match. As George watches the match, Carl walks up to George and gives him an envelope that contains some Polaroid pictures of Patty lying in his bed. George reassures Carl that no matter what happens, he will never sleep with his friend's wife. But Carl does not listen and shoves him. George does not hold back and he pushes Carl back and a fight breaks out between the two. As they both fight, Lewis dribbles the ball across all the defenders and scores another goal, seconds away from halftime. This makes the Cyclones win the championship. It is now the day that George finally leaves Virginia to move to another state. He puts all of the suitcases in his car's trunk and makes a final stop to Lewis. Stacy opens the door and calls Lewis. They sit down under a tree and together both of them plan their future. Lewis promises George that he will call him every single night. George sheds tears and hugs his son whom he loves very dearly, as Stacy watches them from the window. It is when she is looking at them that Matt questions whether she still loves George, and she finally tells him the truth that she does. George hands Lewis a gift before he leaves. It is the first ever medal that he won from football and he wants his son to have it. Finally, he gets up and gives his son a final hug, with the last command to take care of his mother. George gets into his car and drives away, unable to hold his tears back as he crosses every street and finally enters the highway. As he goes down the highway, he drives past the lake he once visited with his son. Something changes inside him and he turns his car around to head back to Stacy's house. As Lewis sees him, he runs towards him and asks him why he is here. George replies that he might want to sit with him tomorrow too and accepts that he cannot leave his son ever. Stacy has been overlooking them all this time and rushes to join them. She runs towards them with a football, which they play with, as the perfect happy family they now are.